Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review.
In this episode of Dis Affamie History podcast, host Wendy Aris uncovers the voices and legacies too often left out of the history books. Stay tuned as we speak with Suleiman Bulbulia, who helps us trace the journeys, struggles, and enduring contributions of African Muslims in the Caribbean. In 1777, a young man named Muhammad Kaba Saganuhu set out on a journey toward Timbuktu. Instead, his life was violently interrupted. Captured and sold into the transatlantic slave trade, he was deported to Jamaica. Yet, despite the chains of enslavement, Saganuhu carried with him something powerful: his faith, his intellect, and his words. In the Caribbean, he composed a remarkable 50-page document written entirely in Arabic. It survives as one of the most extraordinary testaments to the resilience, literacy, and spiritual depth of African Muslims enslaved in the New World. Today, we dive into this often overlooked chapter of Caribbean history, the story of African Muslims who, despite unimaginable hardship, preserved their culture, language, and religion. We'll explore what Saganuhu's writings reveal, how literacy in Arabic shaped identity and resistance, and why these stories matter for how we understand Caribbean heritage today.
I wanted to thank you so much, Suleiman, for coming on to the podcast and speaking about your article that dealt with African Muslims that were enslaved in the Caribbean. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Sure. So I'm Suleiman Bulbulia. I'm from the island of Barbados. I was born, I grew up here, did my education here at the University of the West Indies Gayville campus, degree in management. I've lived most of my life on the island. I've spent some time overseas in Trinidad and in Saudi Arabia, where I did the Arabic language. But most of my life I've been in Barbados, working, studying, growing up. So yeah, I'm from here. My dad is from India. He came in the 50s. My mom was actually born in Barbados of both Indian and Barbadian heritage. So her dad is from India, but my grandmother from my mother's side is actually from the countryside of Barbados. She is a Barbadian of African descent. And yeah, so I have a good mixed history.
Yes, no, we all do, and that's great that you can talk about it. And so we're going to go on that theme. So your maternal ancestry includes African lineage, as you indicated. How
Yes.
has this personal connection shaped your interest in uncovering the histories of African Muslims in the Caribbean?
Well, it has certainly helped me in telling the story, because I think the story is going to be important to be told of our Muslim heritage among the enslaved, and it's not been told too much. Most persons in Barbados and generally in the Caribbean, they tend to associate Islam and Muslims with recent persons coming in the 20th century. In some of the islands, it will be among the indentured servants after the emancipation. In islands like Barbados, it's more migrants, so they tend to associate Islam and Muslims with migrants. What happened is that they tend even to associate Islam as an Indian religion. That was back in the 70s, early 80s. A lot of that has changed now. They see Islam as a global religion, but not understanding that among the enslaved were Muslim. That is what the story that needs to be told. And so my ancestry helps me in that I want to uncover it for myself as well. My great grandmother would have been of African descent, and maybe her mother or grandmother came from Africa. are they Muslim possible? So I want to uncover that history as well for myself personally, but also for widest narrative of were the Muslims among the enslaved coming to Barbados?
No, definitely, because once you start opening up that box, it's like you can't stop and just want to keep digging and digging. Now, did you find that tracing your family roots provided some unique insights into broader historical narratives?
So that's still a work in progress because interestingly enough, when I did some research, so my great grandmother would have been of Barbadian African descent, but my great grandfather was actually from either Ireland or Scottish. So that's kind of because we did have persons from Ireland and Scotland coming to Barbados as poor whites, working also on the plantation. So it's even more mixed than I thought. Yes. So yeah, I need to do some more digging and some more searching to get to that. Yes.
Yes, no, absolutely. And just for the listeners unfamiliar with this history, could you just explain how African Muslims came to be enslaved in the Caribbean?
So, as you know, the enslavement of Africans from in the mid-Atlantic slave trade, starting in the 1500s, 1600s, primarily focused on Western Africa and going into a bit of Central and some into South as well. Most of that area in Western Africa had a predominant Muslim faith and culture. Senegal, Gambia, those countries. Ghana had a mix. Nigeria also had a mix, but predominantly Muslim. So among the areas that the enslaved were taken by the European enslavers and brought in the Middle East had predominant Muslim areas. So it is estimated that around 30% of the millions that were taken as enslaved were Muslims, about 30%, mostly going to America and some to the Caribbean. Many went to Brazil as well. There's many stories out of Brazil of the enslaved. In Haiti, for example, those in the Haitian Revolution higher were of Muslim background from Africa. So you had a mix. You had a mix of persons being captured and taken as slaves, but among them would have been the Muslim because Islam was in that part of the world and was very predominant in that part of the world. Islam first entered into Africa in the 7th century, into Ethiopia. And then as Islam spread, it came from the north down into the south, middle part of Africa and down into the south. As we know, about 75% of Africa today is Muslim. And so in that western area of the Gambia, Ghana, those areas, you find that Muslims are also predominant.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's just, as I said, just very fascinating just to know. And then what made, I guess, their experiences, the African Muslims, more distinct compared to other African groups that were brought over across the Atlantic?
So what research has shown coming out now out of America and some islands in the Caribbean, I'm presently beginning to do my research for Barbados, even out of Brazil as well. You find that most of those Muslims enslaved attempted to keep their faith. So in some way or the other, it was difficult because it was not allowed. Practicing your faith was not allowed, and they actually changed your names and all of that. They try to wipe out your culture and your history and your faith. But you see that coming through glimpses of writings from various people. Praying, for example, there would be accounts from slave owners of the enslaved praying 5 times a day. There are accounts of persons attempting to fast when they figured that it was a month of fasting. The language that they spoke was Arabic. So Arabic so they had the African languages, the mother tongues. But Arabic seems to have been that unifying language among the Muslims of that part of Africa, because they would have learned Arabic as for the purpose of faith, but also as a language. And so the Arabic tended to unify Muslims, African enslaved. And so speaking the Arabic language is one of those indicators that you found that they kept up. The names were changed, so you find that you had now to go back to records and when we were doing our research as to if there was an original name there, or where did they come from? Where did that person originate from, to see if that town or that village or that space or that region was Muslim. But you see elements of it coming up. Language being one, names another, praying another indication of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And of course, this leads us on to Muhammad Kaba, who was captured in 1777 on his way to Timbuktu and then deported to Jamaica.
Yeah.
Now, he left behind a 50-page document in Arabic. Could you share more about, this remarkable text and what it reveals about life and faith?
So what we have learned from findings like this and others is that, what we've been told by the Europeans is that they were taking persons who had no knowledge, no education, no culture, barbaric people. These are things that we have to really destroy, that information or misinformation that what we're given. Persons that were enslaved by the Europeans were persons of knowledge, learning. They were kings, they were princes, they were educators, they were mathematicians, they were different, they were scholars. And so Muhammad Kaba was one of those. He was studying the faith. He was one of the scholars of the faith when he was captured. As you said, on the way to Timbuktu. Timbuktu had one of the most famous universities in that time. Many persons came from many parts of the world to study in Timbuktu because they were scholars and much information was there and it was learning there. And so he was a knowledgeable person. He knew Arabic language. He was a scholar, captured, brought to Jamaica, and he maintained his faith as much as we could read about it. Maintain his faith, even though the name was changed, and he at times would be in a church and so on later on in his life. But this was common because they would hide their faith because it was not allowed. And so you found that persons may adopt certain principles in the Christian faith, but were already Muslim by nature because they kept their faith secret, not wanting to find out. So the document, the 50-page document that he wrote in Arabic, it's said to be a treatise on Islamic laws and teachings of prayer and fasting and how to maintain yourself as a Muslim and what are the rules of prayer and so on. So that 50-page document is available. I think I read recently is in Oxford. I'm not sure if that's still there, but it's an interesting piece document that he wrote in Arabic, 50 pages, and it's about Islamic law and jurisprudence as it relates to prayer and so on. There is in his story also where when they had an uprising, there was another document that was being circulated in Arabic. It is said that perhaps might have come from Africa as a reminder that the Muslims should keep their faith against all odds. And that was being going around. But the story goes is that Muhammad Kaba's wife destroyed that document in fear that the authorities might find it during the uprising. So that needs some more research. But you have in the States, Omar Said writing his whole autobiography in Arabic. He was given freedom, Prince Among Slaves. And there's actually now a opera on him. So you have these accounts coming out as you do more research, as researchers and historians do more. I'm hoping that they will find more things, and that's what we're hoping to find for Barbados. More of this because they could write, they could read. These enslaved were educated people.
Yeah, and how significant is it that to have such a first-hand written account from an enslaved African Muslim in the Caribbean context?
Extremely important, extremely important. It destroys the notion that you have people who were unlettered, illiterate, could not read or write. It destroys that. And in fact, the reality is that when the slave owners found that they had a slave who could read and write, they would make them scribes in the plantations to record everything. You have incidences of this that they were then made to write down records. Barbados is said to have the second largest amount of records in the Western Hemisphere, outside of the UK, of slave accounts of the Mid-Atlantic slave trade. So we need to go through this. Those archives are now being digitized. So hopefully once they're fully digitized, we can then access more what is found in the archives.
Yes, absolutely. That's going to be the key. And then, of course, many African Muslims enslaved in the Caribbean were, as you mentioned, were literate in Arabic,
Yes.
with the ability to read and write and, of course, recite. How did these language and literacy skills impact their survival as well as their identity and cultural preservation?
I think it made a big difference for them because obviously everything else was stripped away. The identity was stripped away. The connection with Africa was stripped away. The connection with their families were also destroyed. And so I could imagine that it meant a lot for them to hold on to these things as reminders of where they were from, as things that they can hold on to. And as much as they could, they did. But I think that was lost, obviously, over the next generations. That began to be lost. But holding on to the languages, there is an account in Barbados, for example, of a Moravian missionary coming into contact with an enslaved, and the enslaved is telling him his story, the missionary, that he was a prince. He was a king when he was taken into captivity, and he could speak Arabic. So they remembered and they have that knowledge, and they tell others about that. And that is what they held on to as long as they could. I think that helped them. Another aspect to this was that we believe that the language which was unifying them, which was perhaps in some cases the Arabic, was used in plotting rebellions and uprisings. So we find that perhaps in the history of the Haitian Revolution. We're looking at that in some of the uprisings in Barbados and other places, that perhaps this was used because as you know, the Africans from different parts of Africa would speak different languages. Yes. But if they had a unifying language, which was in this case among the Muslims would have been Arabic, that would have been a language that would have been used or written form to plan uprisings and rebellions. And you found that Muslims were involved, or of African descent were involved a lot in the rebellions against the enslavement, because Islam teaches that you should stand up against injustice and not just, cow down. So you would imagine that a lot of them would have made an attempt to free themselves, and that did happen in Trinidad. You had the Mandingo Society happening in Trinidad, where they were able to set up their own society and buy back, buy from the enslavers, those of that faith, and so the Mandingo Society is known in Trinidad. In Brazil, there's also evidence of that.
Definitely. And then, of course, I know that you mentioned before about some of their skills being recognized. Was the opposite true in terms of their skills being feared by enslavers and colonial authorities?
Yes, so that's why I believe they had to hide in a lot of cases their faith, their language, their ability to read and write, because that was seen as perhaps not what they wanted. The enslavers would not want a literate, knowledgeable slave. Here on the Codrington plantation, for example, we also have evidence that a number of the enslaved brought there were Muslim by the names that are being found in the registers. But what the Codrington College was particularly horrible about was that they branded their slaves SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or Society. They actually branded them when they got to the plantation. That was all part of that control of the enslaved person. So it was actually a horrible legacy on this particular plantation.
Yeah, definitely. And then I guess in what ways did the African Muslim manage to practice or adapt their faith under enslavement in the Caribbean? I know you mentioned one of it being, kept quiet. Was there anything else?
Well, Sylviana Diouf, in her book, there's a lot of work on this, and she's given some incidences where they did actually were able to practice some aspects of the faith, fasting, for example, giving charity in some cases. And so there is now, as we begin to unpack our history, you find examples of where they were still able to do some practicing, but we also have examples where they couldn't, where it was just totally forbidden and they had to hide and do. So it requires, I think the research needs to be continued. How much more we can look at it, and especially in our Caribbean setting and in the American setting, how much more we can unpack in terms of the knowledge of African Muslims among the enslaved.
And do we still see any traces of Islamic practices or traditions surviving in Caribbean culture today?
Interesting question, and I think that whatever survived may have perhaps been lost now, but it's an interesting question, and I think it requires also looking into. I remember having a conversation with a very good friend of mine who's Barbadian, lives in Canada, became Muslim in the 70s, Black Barbadian. And we were talking about this, and he was saying, you know, as a young man, which for him would have been the 60s, his grandmother would tell him, before you go to bed, you wash your face and you wipe behind your neck and you wash your feet and so on. Now, for us, this is what we call ablution. This is what you do before you prepare for prayers, especially the issue of wiping behind your neck. That's part of our ritual of preparing for prayer. So you wonder where this come from, you know, and is there a connection, you know, between what have passed from generation to generation in terms of making, you know, this is maybe perhaps what they remembered as enslaved people, what they remembered from Africa. This is what they did before they prepare for prayer or prepare for bed. They will wash their limbs. So he mentioned that obviously a lot of that is lost now. The younger generation doesn't do these things, but it's worth looking into.
Definitely worth looking into. And then I guess, how does this story of the African Muslims complicate or enrich our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade and Caribbean slavery?
Well, first and foremost, it needs to be told, it needs to be researched, it needs to come out. And I think that work has been done over years. I mean, if you remember the documentary Roots by Alex Haley, you remember that when he goes back to his original ancestor that was brought from Africa, Kunta Kinte, he's a Muslim, you know, and so that goes back to the 80s, right? 70s, 80s. We need to continue that conversation, continue that research, because I think it's important that we in our generation in this 21st century understood that among those who came from Africa were Muslim, they were knowledgeable, they were literate, and among with other Africans who came who may not be Muslim, but they were also knowledgeable and literate and educated people. They were not, as the Europeans always want to tell us, barbaric people, and they had to enslave them and make them whatever. We have to tell our story, because that helps in our psyche, that helps in our psychology, that helps in our nature. We are people who are proud people, people of knowledge, people of wisdom, people of learning. And we faced the greatest and most horrific form of enslavement the world has ever seen. And how do we begin now to cast aside those legacy of that trauma that remains today? Because that trauma remains. It's passed from one generation to the next generation. Some people don't want to talk about this. It's, you know, some people want us not to talk about it. Even in our country, you have those who don't want to talk about this. They say, no, we have to move on. But to move on, we have to talk about the past. We have to talk about the injustices of the past, and we have to talk about reparations for the past. Because reparations is a very important conversation that needs to be had. Because no one was given reparations on emancipation. They were just said, you're free. The chains are lifted. But you were in the same position, really. You know, economically, you were at the bottom of the ladder. And the reality is that the slave masters was given reparations for emancipation. They were given money for each slave that was emancipated. So these conversations need to be had. The reparations movement is growing, and we need to support it. Among that conversation is African Muslims. And we as Muslim community have to embrace that regardless of where we're from. We don't have to be from Africa to embrace this conversation of among the enslaved were Africans, were Muslims. Among the enslaved were Muslims. And how do we as a community as a whole start to have that conversation about that as well?
No, because I mean, we can only start to move forward once we have acknowledged what that past was, and to start that healing process, right? So until then, we'll still be, you don't necessarily have to talk about it type of thing, right? So are there any other like written works or testimonies like Muhammad Kaba that scholars are studying that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think there's also Abu Bakr Siddiq in Jamaica that is being looked at. There's the Mandingo Society and Muhammad Baf in Trinidad. There's what they call the Fulaman in Guyana, or the Fulani. There is evidence in Suriname in South America as well. I know there's work being done in North America. So there is work happening. In Brazil, a lot of work has been done in Bahia, on the uprisings. Interestingly enough, as we are having this conversation, we have in Barbados now Carifesta, which is the Caribbean Festival of Arts. It happens I'm not sure every so often, but we have it in Barbados. And one of the features this year of Carifesta was a theatrical production out of Ghana and they did Mansa Musa, and they were talking about Mansa Musa, and it was a fantastic play. It's worth seeing. I got the opportunity to see it on Thursday, and I met the principal behind it yesterday. We had a wonderful conversation, Chief Momin, and we were talking about this. And one of the professors there that does some research for the play, he was talking about doing a play on enslavement and the mid-Atlantic slave trade. And we were talking about talking about the African woman, and he didn't even look at it from that angle. He said that's kind of angle that he wants to look at it from now that we have talked about it. Because you need to start to do more work and through books, but also through the arts, through culture, through spoken word, through poetry. All of that has to come together in telling the story, because the story has to be told. And how do we do it? We do it in different ways. Young people nowadays don't necessarily take up a book and read. They go to TikTok and they go to movies or whatever. We need to put it in there as well. We have to find all sorts of ways of getting the story out of this and getting the researchers to do more research.
Mm-hmm. And how can acknowledging these stories reshape the way we think about Caribbean heritage and, of course, identity today?
Very important, because in a post-colonial Caribbean, we have to start to dissect the colonial themes that we have been given, the colonial education that we have been subjected to. So when I was a younger person in school doing history, you would do a lot of European history. We started to have some Caribbean history and so on. We need to do a lot more African history. But the Caribbean history, especially as it relates to Africa, needs to be unpacked and told. So I think that is important in going forward, that it helps us to understand who we are, where we came from, and what our real history is. And that then we then begin to have a mindset. We're facing a crisis in the Caribbean among our younger generation. They don't have an identity. Sadly, the identity among a lot of the younger generation is in gangs and so on. Not widespread, but it creates a problem when it comes to violence and so on. And that's throughout the region. So how do we start to get at a younger generation in terms of where we came from, who we were, who we are, where we're going? We have a proud history that we need to be proud about and to talk about. How does that shape us today to be better human beings and to be better people? So all of that needs to come into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. And, Suleiman, as we end the episode, would you have any final thoughts for anyone, for our listeners, just to say what it means and to know this part of the history for African Muslims coming into the Caribbean?
So I think let me thank you very much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. It's an important conversation that we should have more often. And I think that the topic or the subject is not only relevant to Muslims, but to everyone, because I think that as we live in a world that is becoming closer through technology, and we live in a world where there's a lot of diversity, but where you also find people who are opposed to diversity. It's how do we navigate this world where there's polarization taking place, yet we are bringing the world closer together by technology? So how do we navigate? So the conversations around among the enslaved were Muslims, were different people of different backgrounds and races, not races, but different faith beliefs and cultures. How do we start to talk about that and bring that into the 21st century? Because we want to build a world where we're building bridges and not building walls. And sadly, there are those who are intent on building walls. So we have to now be intent on building bridges to break down those walls. And it's going to be important that we keep the conversations going. As I said, it's not only about talking about that's important to me because I'm a Muslim, but the subject is it's a wider subject. It's wider. It's part of a wider conversation. That there is diversity. There has always been diversity. It was not one set of people that were taken from Africa. It was different sets of people, all stuffed into a ship and brought here. What did that mean? How did they get along? How did they live together? And yes, there are hard parts of this conversation, because we know that in Africa, there were those who were responsible for also selling their brothers and sisters to the Europeans. That's part of the conversation. That's the hard part of the conversation. That has to enter into conversation as well. So it's important that we have it.
Yes, I agree that we have it and we continue to have it no matter the uncomfortableness of it in order, again, it's part of that whole moving forward, and we can't do that until we reconcile some things first. So, but Suleiman, I do want to thank you so much for coming on, giving your time, speaking to this. This is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.